Welcome to True Crime Files. I'm your host Ben Carter, and in today's episode we're stepping into a darkness few dare to explore. A case so disturbing, so inhuman, that even seasoned detectives were left shaken. Two seemingly ordinary men with a van and a secret compartment filled with unimaginable horrors, hidden cassette tapes, muffled screams, and a trail of shattered lives. This is not just another serial killer story. This is the story of the Toolbox Killers and the most disturbing tapes ever found. Stay tuned. In 1979, the golden sunshine of Southern California masked something sinister lurking beneath its idyllic surface. It was a time of disco and denim, but for a string of young girls who vanished without a trace, it was the end of everything. Behind their disappearances were two men, Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, names that would soon become etched into the annals of American horror. Bittaker and Norris didn't start out as monsters together. In fact, they met in prison, California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo, a maximum security facility housing some of the state's most dangerous offenders. Bittaker was serving time for assault with a deadly weapon. Norris was in for rape. But what brought them together wasn't just circumstance. It was ideology, shared fantasies, a chilling mutual interest in violence, especially toward young girls. They formed a pact while behind bars. Once they got out, they agreed they'd join forces and make their fantasies real. It wasn't just talk, they meant it. And when they were both paroled within months of each other in 1979, they wasted no time putting their plan into motion. They acquired a van, an inconspicuous silver 1977 GMC they nicknamed Murder Mac. It looked like any work van of the era. But the inside was a different story. Bittaker customized it, removing the back seats and lining the walls with plywood to muffle sound. He added a bed, tools, and, most chillingly, a homemade cabinet to house what would become their instruments of torture. The plan was disturbingly calculated. They would cruise the Pacific Coast Highway and surrounding streets, targeting girls between 13 and 19. Girls who were hitchhiking, walking alone, or just in the wrong place at the wrong time. They took turns luring victims. Sometimes Bittaker played the smooth talker, other times Norris feigned kindness or asked for directions. Once inside the van, the doors locked, and there was no way out. They weren't impulsive killers. They practiced. Before they committed their first murder, they rehearsed with other girls, abducting them, assaulting them, and then releasing them. It was like they were warming up for the real thing. By the time they selected their first kill, they were methodical, coordinated, and terrifyingly confident. This was not just a killing spree. This was a carefully orchestrated campaign of sadism. One fueled not just by violence, but by domination, recording, and control. They documented much of it. That would become one of the most horrifying details of all. Because Bittaker and Norris didn't just kill. They listened to their victims. They watched, and they recorded everything. Lawrence Bittaker was born in September 1940 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Adopted by a couple who worked in aircraft factories, Bittaker spent much of his childhood moving from city to city as his adoptive father's job relocated the family. By the time he was a teenager, he'd already racked up a record, shoplifting, petty theft, and car theft. But it wasn't just the crimes. There was something missing in Bittaker that no amount of punishment or redirection could fix. He seemed to lack empathy. He treated people, especially women, as objects, and as he grew older, that cold detachment deepened. By 17, Bittaker was in and out of juvenile detention centers. He spent the majority of his adult life behind bars. Whenever he was out, he reoffended. When he was in, he read obsessively, especially books about mechanical engineering and electronics. He was highly intelligent. That was part of what made him so dangerous. Intelligence without conscience can be a lethal combination. By the time he landed in San Luis Obispo, he had over 20 arrests on his record and no real ties to anyone on the outside, except one. Roy Norris was his opposite in many ways, but equally disturbed. Born in 1948, Norris grew up in Colorado in a home marked by neglect, instability, and abuse. He claimed his mother was a drug-addicted housewife and his father an absentee figure. As a child, he bounced between relatives and foster homes, some of which he later said were physically and sexually abusive. By his early teens, Norris was already showing classic signs of psychopathy, voyeurism, fantasies of assault, and an obsession with control. At 17, he joined the Navy. He was stationed in San Diego but was discharged a few years later, diagnosed with a psychological disorder after a series of sexual assaults. His discharge didn't end his violence. In the mid-1970s, he was arrested for multiple offences, including rape. The judge deemed him a mentally disordered sex offender and committed him to a Atascadero State Hospital. But he didn't stay long. He convinced psychiatrists he was rehabilitated. Within a few years, he was back in the system, this time for another assault. That's what finally brought him to San Luis Obispo. That's where he met Bittaker. Their conversations began casually, prison politics, jokes, small talk. But over time they realized they shared something darker, a fantasy of sexual violence, domination and murder. Their cell block gave them the privacy to explore those ideas in depth. They bonded over the idea that society had wronged them, that women in particular were to blame for their failings. It wasn't just delusion, it was a shared pathology. A budding ideology of hate and control disguised as friendship. By the time they were released in 1979, the world outside hadn't changed much, but they had. The fantasies they nurtured inside prison walls had grown teeth. They weren't content with watching or imagining anymore. They wanted to act. They wanted to capture suffering in real time. Not just for the moment, but to relive it again and again, and they knew exactly how to begin. The first known victim was Lucinda Lynn Schaefer, 15 years old, soft-spoken, with long dark hair and braces. On June 24, 1979, she disappeared after attending a church youth group meeting in Torrance, California. It was a warm evening. She had been walking home alone, no more than a few blocks from safety, when the silver van pulled up beside her. Inside, Bittaker and Norris had already rehearsed this moment. They had role-played the approach, the grab, the silencing. Norris leaned out and asked for help finding a lost address. It was bait, and Lucinda took it. When she came close, Bittaker slid the van door open and Norris grabbed her. In one swift movement, she was dragged inside. The door slammed shut and the van disappeared into the California night. They drove her into the mountains, away from the city lights. Lucinda pleaded with them. She was polite, calm even. She told them she wouldn't tell anyone if they let her go. Bittaker would later recount with disturbing detachment that her composure frustrated him. She wasn't giving him the reaction he wanted, but it wouldn't save her. What happened in that van was brutal and prolonged. They bound her, gagged her, and took turns assaulting her. Bittaker later admitted to recording audio of her final hours. He kept it as a trophy. After they finished, they debated what to do with her. Norris wanted to strangle her quickly, but Bittaker had another idea. He insisted she be killed more quietly, so they used a wire coat hanger, twisted tightly with vice-grip pliers. It was cold, calculated, and excruciatingly slow. They dumped her body off a cliff near the San Gabriel Mountains. Her remains were never recovered. Just 2 weeks later, they struck again. Andrea Joy Hall was 18, blonde, smiling, with a quiet confidence. On July 8th, she was hitchhiking along the Pacific Coast Highway. It was common at the time. Hitchhiking wasn't just tolerated, it was normalized. Bittaker and Norris offered her a ride. She accepted. This time, their approach was different. They picked her up in plain view of another driver. So they planned a fake photo opportunity to get her alone. After briefly letting her out, Norris waited in the back of the van. When she re-entered, he attacked her. Andrea's ordeal was even more prolonged. Bittaker photographed her in degrading poses. He forced her to say things for the tape recorder. He stabbed her multiple times in the chest with an ice pick before finally strangling her. Again, her body was thrown down a remote ravine. Again, no trace was found. There were no witnesses, no forensic evidence, and no connections made between the missing girls. The public was largely unaware. To police, these were isolated disappearances. California was a sprawling state, and teenage runaways weren't uncommon. But something darker was taking root. The van kept moving, the patterns repeating, and no one knew yet that predators were stalking the streets with a toolbox of terror in the back of a van. The investigation into the string of disappearances remained fragmented for months. With no physical evidence, no crime scenes, and victims often categorized as runaways, local law enforcement agencies had little to go on. The cases weren't immediately connected. Different jurisdictions handled them independently, and there was no centralized database to track missing teens across county lines. It wasn't until October 1979, when Shirley Lynette Ledford's body was found discarded on a residential lawn in Sunland, that the investigation truly began to take shape. Unlike the previous victims, Shirley's remains were not hidden in the mountains. Her injuries were extensive, signs of sexual assault, blunt force trauma, and strangulation. And this time there was no ambiguity. This was not a runaway. This was murder. Violent, intentional, and cruel. The placement of her body, so public, so brazen, suggested something different, a shift. The killers wanted her to be found. It was a message, though not one police could immediately decipher. The brutality of the murder, however, raised red flags. It was methodical, unusually sadistic. Something about it didn't feel isolated. Still, the case remained unsolved, until a man named Joseph Jackson came forward. He was a fellow inmate of Roy Norris, recently released from prison. During their time together, Norris had spoken freely, too freely, about the things he and Bittaker had done. He bragged about abducting teenage girls, described the van in detail, and even mentioned using tools, pliers, ice picks, as weapons. Jackson initially thought it was bravado, prison talk. But after seeing a news report about the Ledford murder, something clicked. He went straight to the authorities. Detectives acted quickly. They brought Norris in for questioning. What started as a standard interview soon turned into something more. Norris, likely fearing Bittaker would flip on him first, confessed. In chilling detail, he described the van, the mountain locations, and the role each man had played. He spoke of the tape recordings, the tools, the photographs. He even offered to lead police to the disposal sites. Search warrants were issued for Bittaker's residence and the van. What they found was damning. In Bittaker's apartment, they discovered hundreds of photographs of young girls, some taken without the subject's knowledge. In the van, police uncovered a collection of tools, hammers, pliers, an ice pick, duct tape. But the most horrifying discovery came from a small cassette recorder and a single audio tape labelled simply Ledford. The tape was played only once for the court. Prosecutors, detectives, and the judge listened to Shirley Ledford's final moments as she screamed, begged, and cried, her voice recorded in real time as she was tortured to death. Jurors and seasoned officers wept. Several court officials left the room. One detective later said it was the most disturbing thing he had ever heard. With Norris's full cooperation and the physical evidence in hand, police had everything they needed. The case had finally cracked open. But what it revealed was something far more grotesque than anyone had imagined. What emerged from the psychological evaluations of Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris was a portrait of predation without remorse. Neither man fit the classic mold of a frenzied, disorganized killer. Their crimes were carefully planned, methodically executed, and rooted not in desperation, but in desire. Desire for control, for dominance, for suffering. Lawrence Bittaker was labelled a classic sociopath, intelligent, manipulative, and devoid of empathy. He exhibited what psychologists referred to as a compensatory fantasy life, in which the feelings of inadequacy and rejection he'd carried since adolescence were masked by carefully constructed delusions of superiority. He believed he was smarter than the system, untouchable, even noble in his rebellion against societal norms. His calm demeanour, even in the face of overwhelming evidence, was chilling. He viewed the victims as expendable, nameless entries in a violent game designed to feed his sense of power. But it was more than power. Bittaker took pleasure in fear. He wasn't satisfied with simply killing. He needed to see the terror, to hear it, to preserve it. That's why he recorded, not as evidence but as trophies, playback for pleasure. That particular hallmark, recording the torment, was rare even among serial killers. It spoke to a need to relive dominance, a craving for the psychological echo of control. Roy Norris, by contrast, was impulsive and unstable. He had a long history of sexual violence and an ingrained hatred toward women. Psychiatrists believed his early exposure to abuse and rejection shaped a deep resentment, one he masked with crude humour and bursts of violence. While Bittaker was calculated, Norris was reactive. He acted out of rage, often under Bittaker's direction, and appeared to rely on his partner for a sense of purpose and identity. Alone, he may have continued as a serial sexual predator, but with Bittaker his crimes escalated into something far more sinister. FBI profilers analysing the case after the fact noted a dynamic that's disturbingly common in paired serial killers, the dominant-submissive relationship. One leads, the other enables. Bittaker was the mind, Norris was the muscle, and together they fed off each other's depravity in a feedback loop of escalating cruelty. Their shared fantasies were not static, they evolved. The level of violence increased with each victim. The recordings became more elaborate, the cruelty more sadistic. What disturbed psychologists most was not just the acts themselves, but the intent behind them. These were not crimes of passion, not spur-of-the-moment killings. These were rituals, performances, designed to exert absolute control over another human being's life and death. The tools, the pliers, the wire, the tape were not just instruments of murder. They were symbols of domination, of silence imposed. Neither man showed genuine remorse. In interviews, Norris wept, but not for the girls, for himself, for his fate. Bittaker, on the other hand, remained defiant. He claimed the tapes proved nothing, claimed the girls consented, lied, deflected, as if clinging to the last illusion of control. But inside their minds there was no redemption, only vacancy. A hollow, calculating absence of humanity that defied even the darkest psychological profiles. In the aftermath of the arrests, the judicial process began swiftly, but the sheer gravity of the crimes required a meticulous approach. Roy Norris, aware that the evidence was overwhelming and fearing the death penalty, agreed to a plea deal. In exchange for testifying against Bittaker, he received 45 years to life and avoided capital punishment. His confession was extensive, detailed, and damning. It provided investigators with a full timeline, names, locations, and descriptions of the murders, many of which they'd only suspected until then. Lawrence Bittaker, meanwhile, pleaded not guilty. His trial began in early 1981, in a courtroom filled with tension, dread, and the grim knowledge that those who sat through the proceedings would be forced to hear things that could not be unheard. The prosecution built their case carefully. Norris's testimony, while powerful, was only one piece. The physical evidence from the van, the photographs, the tape recording of Shirley Ledford's final moments, these became the pillars of the case. The jury was played a portion of the tape. It lasted about 17 minutes. What they heard would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Court reporters cried openly, jurors turned away. One even vomited outside the courtroom. It was the audio equivalent of a descent into hell. But it worked. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury delivered their verdict, guilty on all counts. 5 counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of kidnapping, rape, and criminal conspiracy. For Bittaker, there would be no deal, no escape. He was sentenced to death on March 24, 1981. Bittaker was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he would spend the rest of his life on death row. Over the years he filed appeals, wrote letters, and even gave interviews, often cold, mechanical explanations that tried to minimize or deflect the weight of his crimes. But the sentence held. He remained incarcerated for nearly 4 decades, until he died of natural causes in December 2019 at the age of 79. There were no last words of remorse, no apologies, just silence. Norris, meanwhile, remained in prison, denied parole at every hearing. He died in 2020 of natural causes, never again walking free. The case was officially closed, but not entirely put to rest. Of the 5 known victims, only Shirley Ledford's body was ever recovered. The other 4, Lucinda Schaefer, Andrea Hall, Jackie Gilliam, and Leah Lamp, were never found, despite Norris leading investigators to what he claimed were the dumping sites. The terrain was remote, the bodies likely scattered by wildlife or erosion. For the families, closure remained elusive. The toolbox used in the murders, the van, and the tape all became infamous pieces of evidence, iconic in the most tragic sense. They were studied by criminologists, FBI profilers, and students of forensic psychology for years to come. Though justice had been served in the legal sense, the story of the Toolbox Killers left a scar, a reminder that sometimes evil doesn't wear a monster's face. Sometimes it looks like just another man in a van, passing you by on an ordinary street. In the years following the convictions, the case of the Toolbox Killers continued to stir public fascination and professional scrutiny. What began as a closed chapter in California's criminal history quietly evolved into a subject of renewed interest, not because the perpetrators were still active, but because the full scope of their crimes may never have been fully uncovered. Forensic experts and criminal profilers who later re-examined the evidence began to question whether the number of victims was truly limited to 5. Norris himself hinted, during his many prison interviews, that there may have been others, girls who were assaulted and released, or possibly murdered and never connected to the case. He once remarked that there were more tapes, but refused to elaborate. Investigators could never confirm if those additional recordings existed, or if Norris was simply toying with the truth in a bid for attention or leniency. The photographs found in Bittaker's possession offered their own disturbing mystery. Among the hundreds of images were several young women who were never identified, some clearly taken without their knowledge, others posed in ways that suggested coercion or fear. Despite efforts by law enforcement and missing persons units, many of those faces remain unnamed, their stories unknown. The LAPD revisited the files as recently as the mid-2000s, attempting to run facial recognition scans through updated databases. A few were matched to survivors, women who had been approached, harassed, or even abducted, but managed to escape. Others had no digital footprint at all, as if they had vanished. Then there's the matter of the tapes. The infamous Ledford tape is the only known recording that was ever recovered, but court transcripts refer to more than one. Norris reportedly spoke of others, particularly during pre-sentencing psychological evaluations, yet no additional audio has surfaced. Some believe Bittaker may have destroyed them in the days leading up to his arrest. Others think they're still out there, tucked away in storage, hidden by a collector, or possibly buried in the mountains near the old crime scenes. A particularly strange twist emerged in the late 1990s, when a retired detective received a letter from an anonymous source claiming to have seen Bittaker in the San Gabriel Mountains with a camera crew in the summer of '79. The letter alleged that the men weren't just documenting the crimes for themselves, but had considered selling the tapes to underground markets. No evidence ever supported the claim, but it stirred an old fear that these murders weren't just acts of evil, they were performances, created, recorded, and possibly shared. In recent years, true crime researchers have continued combing through the case for overlooked details, some working with families of the missing, who wonder if their loved ones crossed paths with Bittaker and Norris. A handful of podcasts and documentaries have reignited public awareness, leading to new tips and anonymous emails. Whether any of those leads will result in fresh discoveries remains to be seen. But the shadows left behind by the Toolbox Killers are long, and some doors once opened never fully close. The name Toolbox Killers has become synonymous with a specific kind of horror, cold, calculated, and amplified by the knowledge that these men operated unnoticed for months in plain view. Their story isn't one of frantic violence or unhinged madness. It's one of planning, restraint, and a meticulous pursuit of pain. And that's perhaps what makes it so terrifying. Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris didn't look like monsters. They didn't operate in the shadows like some mythic figures from urban legend. They drove a van through suburban neighborhoods, visited gas stations, parked near beaches. They passed people every day, on sidewalks, at red lights, in parking lots, without raising suspicion. That's the truth buried at the heart of this story. That evil, when it chooses to hide, often wears the most ordinary face. Their crimes shattered families, traumatized investigators, and left scars that never healed. And even with both men now dead, the questions haven't stopped. Were there more victims? Did the tapes show more than what was recovered? Why did they leave Shirley Ledford's body in the open after hiding the others? Was it a final act of defiance, or the beginning of something even darker that was never realized. In the years since their conviction, criminologists and psychologists have used the case as a blueprint for understanding paired serial killers, how dominant-submissive dynamics can create something exponentially more dangerous than either individual alone. Bittaker, the brain; Norris, the follower. One without the other may have continued a path of crime. Together they built a machine of cruelty, one that roamed the streets in a silver van, hunting for girls who simply wanted to get home. And for those girls, Lucinda, Andrea, Jackie, Leah, Shirley, the world barely remembers their names. They became entries in a list eclipsed by the notoriety of the men who took them. But they were daughters, friends, bright, young lives on the verge of everything. Their names should echo longer than the killers. Their stories deserve more space than the violence. Justice, in its procedural form, was served. The sentences were carried out. The courtroom saw the evidence, the jurors heard the screams. But justice has another face, the quieter, more complicated one. It's the one that lingers in the families who never recovered remains, in the unanswered questions, in the unknown names staring back from those old photographs. And so we end not with resolution, but with reverence, for the lost and for those still searching. Some crimes stain more than the pages of a case file. They imprint themselves on history, on memory, and on every road we now pass with just a little more caution. I'm Ben Carter, and this has been True Crime Files. Join us next week as we uncover a case of betrayal, hidden identities, and a shocking twist that turned a missing persons report into a national obsession. Until then, stay aware, stay safe, and remember, evil doesn't always knock. Sometimes it's already in the rearview. Thanks for listening. I'm your host, Ben Carter, and this has been another episode of True Crime Files. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to follow, subscribe, and share the show with your fellow true crime enthusiasts. I'll be back next time to uncover more chilling mysteries. Until then, stay safe out there. If you enjoyed this episode and want to dive deeper into the world of true crime, consider subscribing for exclusive access to content you won't find anywhere else.